Nothing else for now.
All right, then.
This is Nathan Cole, broadcasting from somewhere in Central California. It's 11:43 on Tuesday night, February 14th. 11 months since the world decided to burn itself down. My dosimeter is sitting next to the microphone, reading 0.8 microsieverts per hour, which is about as normal gets anymore. I need to tell you about today because if I don't document this, if someone doesn't record what it actually takes to survive one regular Tuesday in the fallout, then we're just going to disappear like we never mattered at all. Today started bad. I woke up at dawn in my fire station, same as always, and the first thing I do every morning is check my water supply. I've got this rainwater collection system I rigged up on the roof, runs down through a series of filters I salvaged from a hardware store back in October. It's kept me alive this long. Except this morning when I went to fill my bottle, the water came out green. Algae bloom. The whole filtration barrel was contaminated.
What's all
Probably
this?
been growing for days, and I didn't notice because I wasn't paying attention.
What's all this, then? Not this time.
The kind of stupid that kills you out here.
Fine, then.
I had maybe half a liter of clean water left in my canteen. That's it. An adult needs 2 liters minimum per day just to function. More if you're moving around, sweating, doing the kind of physical work that staying alive requires.
Rubbish.
I stood there in the early light looking at that green water and doing the math in my head. I could boil it, sure, but boiling doesn't remove chemical contamination, and I had no idea what was growing in there. Could make me sick, which out here is basically a death sentence. My stomach was already cramping from dehydration. I hadn't drunk anything since yesterday afternoon. So I pulled out my map, the one I've been marking up for months with radiation readings. I had 2 options. There's a shopping center about 3 miles east where I knew there were abandoned cars, and cars sometimes have bottled water in the trunks, glove boxes, places people stashed emergency supplies before everything collapsed. But to get there, I'd have to cut through what used to be a rail yard, and that whole area is hot. 15 microsieverts per hour last time I checked. The railroad ties soaked up fallout like a sponge, and they're going to be dangerous for years. My cumulative exposure is already sitting around 47 millisieverts since the war started. I don't have the margin to add another 5 or 6 just for water. The other option was a creek about a mile south. Before the bombs, I wouldn't have even considered drinking from it. Probably had agricultural runoff, all kinds of contamination on it. But now the question isn't whether it's clean by old standards, it's whether the radiation will kill me faster than thirst. I grabbed my dosimeter, my backpack with the chemical test kit I'd taken from an old high school science lab, and I headed south. The morning was cold, that February kind of cold where your breath makes clouds and everything feels dead and empty. No birds anymore. The walk took 40 minutes because I had to navigate around collapsed buildings and areas I know are too hot to cross. There's this whole section of housing development that got hit with direct fallout. Must have been right in the path when the wind was blowing east. dosimeter screams when you get within 200 meters. I've marked it on my map with red, which means don't go there unless you want to die slowly over the next month. When I finally reached the creek, the dosimeter reading jumped to 5.2 microsieverts per hour.
We'll make nice.
Not great,
Promise.
not terrible.
Found you,
It's the kind of exposure where you can stay for maybe 30 minutes before you need to get out. The creek was slow-moving, muddy, and the banks were covered in this dried crust that used to be algae or moss or something. I could see trash stuck in the dead vegetation, plastic bottles, a kid's shoe, all the things that washed down from somewhere upstream. I started checking the bottles first, hoping to find something sealed, something I wouldn't have to risk with the creek water. Most were empty or filled with stagnant water that had been sitting for months. Then I saw one, a disposable bottle half buried in the mud near a bent shopping cart. I pulled it out and the seal was intact, unopened. I actually laughed, which is something I don't do much anymore. That's when I slipped. The bank was slick from yesterday's condensation and my boot went out from under me. I fell hard on my side and my leg dragged across something sharp. When I looked down, there was blood soaking through my pants, a lot of it, and sticking out of the mud was this jagged piece of old fence wire, rusted orange and probably living in that radioactive dirt for 11 months. I pulled my pant leg up and the cut was deep, maybe 4 inches long, bleeding steady, not spurting, so no major vessels hit, but deep enough that I knew it wasn't going to stop on its own. I didn't have clean water to rinse it. That was the problem. Everything around me was contaminated to
How
some
you doing in
degree,
there, Valentine?
including the creek water I'd been about to test.
Want a snack?
Keep
My
talking,
dosimeter was
meathead.
ticking faster
It'll
now,
give Skinny
reminding me I was
Malone more
sitting in a
time to
hot
think
zone,
about how he's gonna
and I
bump
had a
you
choice
off.
to make.
Don't give me that crap,
Leave the
Valentine.
wound
You
dirty
know
and
nothing,
risk
you got
infection,
nothing.
Really?
or rinse it with radioactive
Saw him write your
treatment
name
and risk
down in
worse
that black book
contamination.
of
No
his.
way I could pick this.
Lousy, cheating card shark,
Infection
I
out
think
here
were
is
his
a slow
exact
killer.
words.
I've seen
Then he
it.
struck
I
the
knew a
name
guy named
across
David
3
Harper back in
times.
the first
3
few
strikes?
months. Got a
In the
cut on
black
his
book?
hand from a broken
But I never...
window.
Oh,
It
no.
was nothing, just a
I
little
gotta slow
slice.
this over, fast.
But it got infected, and he didn't have antibiotics. None of us did by that point. I watched him die over 3 weeks. Started with redness and swelling, then fever, then he couldn't move his arm. And by the end, he was delirious and his whole body was shutting down. He was maybe 30 years old. I used the creek water, poured it over the wound, watched the blood wash away
Sweet.
pink into the mud. It stung like acid. Then I tore a piece
Hey,
off
you!
my shirt and wrapped it
I
tight,
know who you are,
tied it
but we
off,
got
and
3
tried not to
minutes
think about what I
before they
just
realize-
exposed myself to. The bleeding slowed down but didn't stop completely. I could feel it soaking through the fabric. I grabbed the sealed water bottle I'd found, stuffed it in my pack along with 4 others I managed to locate in
Bingo.
the debris.
Ah, my knight in shining
My
armor.
dosimeter read
Question
3.1
is,
millisieverts
why does he come all this
accumulated by
way?
the time
Risk
I was
life
clear.
and limb. Old
That's
private
bad.
arm.
That's almost a month of normal background exposure condensed into 45 minutes. The walk back was harder because my leg was screaming, and I was trying not to limp, trying not to favor it, because showing weakness out here is dangerous even when there's nobody around. You train yourself to move normally, to look strong, because you never know who's watching. About halfway back to the fire station, I had to stop and check the wound again. The fabric was soaked through, deep red, and when I peeled it back, the cut was still
I'm
seeping.
tracking a murderer.
I pressed
The
the bandage
bastard
harder
who
and
shot
kept
my wife.
moving. The
Took
sun
my
was
son.
fully up by then, maybe 8 in the morning.
I don't even have a
The
clue
day
who
was
he
turning
is or
warm.
where he's gone.
So, you need a little angel of vengeance, huh? Well,
I
I don't
thought about
usually
the
go
early
after
days a
blood
lot
money,
during
but
that
I
walk.
guess I can make an exception.
Right after the
I've been
bombs
cooped
fell,
up in here for
it wasn't
weeks.
the radiation
Turns
that
out
killed
the
most
runaway
people.
daughter I came here to find wasn't
panic.
kidnapped.
People got in their
Skinny
cars and
Malone's
tried to
new
drive away
flame.
from the cities.
And she's
But
got
where
a
do you go
mean
when the
streak.
whole country
Anyway,
is
you
burning?
got troubles,
The
and I'm
highway's
glad to help.
jammed up within
But
hours.
now ain't the time. Let's blow this
I
joint.
remember walking
Then we'll
past
talk.
this massive pileup on Highway 99, maybe 2 months after. Must have been 60 or 70
Malone's
cars
crew
all
here
smashed
used to be
together.
small time.
And every single one
Muscled
had
out of the
bodies
old neighborhood
inside.
by bigger planes.
Some people died from the crashes, but most of them just died waiting. Radiation sickness, starvation, thirst. You could tell by looking at them which ones had tried to walk away and which ones stayed in their cars hoping someone would come help. Nobody came.
Don't know what happened to the previous
Back at
owners,
the
but
fire
they're not
station, I
exactly
tested the
around to
water
charge
bottles with my
rent.
chemical kit.
Empty vault.
3 of them were
Perfect
relatively clean, low radiation, safe enough to drink. The other 2 were questionable, but I kept them anyway because questionable water is better than no water. I drank 1 entire bottle right there.
Hey,
Didn't even
Valentine.
stop to think
Help me
about
get out of
rationing.
here.
Just
then
drank
I'll
it.
help you.
My body was screaming for water, and I gave it what it
Hold
wanted.
on. I hear
Then
someone.
I sat down and properly cleaned
they
the
are.
leg wound with one of
How
the
do you
good
want to play
bottles.
this?
Used up half of it, just rinsing. And then I broke open the first aid kit I'd been
Nick.
saving.
I know you have a case
Antiseptic
you want
cream
solved,
that
but
expired 8
underground and
months ago.
surrounded is not the
Probably
best place to
useless.
talk.
But I slathered it on anyway. Then I used the real bandages,
Thought I
the
saw.
sterile ones I'd been hoarding, and wrapped the leg tight. The wound was going to get infected. I knew that already. It was too deep, too dirty, and I'd used contaminated water on it. What I needed was antibiotics, real ones, not expired tubes of topical cream. I had exactly 3 pills left from a bottle I
Hey,
found
Valentine.
back in November.
You really want to do
3
this
pills.
here? With
Not
these
even
humans?
close to a full course of treatment. I knew where I could get more. There was a
Like
pharmacy
groceries
in a
around
strip
every
mall
corner?
about 2 miles away that I'd been avoiding because it was in a contested area, places where other survivors sometimes scavenged, and running into people out here is always a risk. But I didn't have a choice anymore. Infected wounds don't wait for you to feel safe. By
Hard
the
and
time I'd
loud,
finished
huh?
bandaging and
Well, gets the
rehydrating,
job done.
it was almost
Bad
10
for
in the
whoever
morning.
cleans up the floors.
4 hours
This
into
door's
Tuesday,
on the fritz.
and I'd
Let me see
already
if I can
burned
get it
through
open.
one of my good water bottles, accumulated dangerous radiation exposure,
There we
and
go.
guaranteed myself an infection that might kill me in a week if I didn't find antibiotics. And the day wasn't even half over. That's what I mean when I say survival out here isn't some dramatic last stand against impossible odds. It's just this. It's a cut of rusty wire. It's green water in your filtration system. It's the constant grinding calculation of whether the thing that might kill you today is worse than the thing that will definitely kill you tomorrow. I sat there on the floor of the fire station, leg throbbing, and I thought about how Tuesday used to mean nothing.
What?
It was the most boring day of the week. Not Monday with its fresh start, not Wednesday hump day, not Friday with the weekend coming. Tuesday, the day you survived to get to Tuesday. And now that's exactly what it is again, except the stakes are just a little bit higher. I checked my dosimeter one more time. 0.9 microsieverts per hour. Acceptable. I still had 10 hours of daylight left and a whole list of things that needed doing just to make it to Wednesday. The leg wound could wait. The antibiotics couldn't. I grabbed my backpack, checked my knife, and headed out toward the pharmacy. That was my plan. Water. The kind of Tuesday that doesn't make the news stories because there's no hero
Skinny Malone and the rest of his boys are waiting for us somewhere. The name's, ironic, but don't let that fool you. He's dangerous.
The pharmacy was in a strip mall that used to have a grocery store,
Another
a
locked
nail
door.
salon, one of those phone repair shops that never seemed to have customers even before the world ended. I got there around 10:30 and my stomach was eating itself from the inside. Last time I'd eaten was yesterday morning. Some canned soup that tasted like rust and salt. When you're running on empty like that, your brain starts getting foggy, and foggy thinking in a radiation zone will kill you just as dead as a hot spot. You need calories to make decisions,
Don't have the key.
and every single moment out here is a
But I hear
decision.
big fat footsteps on the other side. Once we
The
step
strip
through
mall
this door,
parking
get
lot
ready
was
for
cracked
anything.
concrete with weeds pushing through, shopping carts tipped over, cars sitting on flat rubber that used to be functional wheels. My dosimeter read 1.4 microsieverts per hour, which was higher than I liked, but manageable for a quick in and out.
Nicky,
The
what are
problem
you
was
doing?
getting to the pharmacy.
Come into my house, shoot
The
up my
direct
guys?
route meant
You
crossing
have
what
any
used to be
idea
the
how much
loading
this is
area
gonna set
behind
me
the
back?
grocery store.
I wouldn't be
and I knew
here
from
if it weren't
previous
for your
scouting
two-timing
that the
games,
drainage
Skinny.
there had collected
Ought to tell her to
fallout.
write home more often.
Water
Oh,
pools in low areas,
poor little
fallout
Valentine.
settles, and
Ashamed
suddenly
you got
you've got a
beat up by a
radiation trap that
girl.
looks like any
I'll
other
just
puddle.
run back home to Daddy, shall I?
Should have left it alone,
I
Nicky.
had to go through the buildings
This ain't the old
instead.
neighborhood.
The
In
nail
this vault,
salon was a
I'm
shell,
king of the castle. You
windows
hear me?
blown out,
And I ain't letting some
interior
private
stripped
dick
bare
shut us
by
down now that I
scavengers
finally
months
got a
ago.
good thing going.
I
I
told
stepped
you
through
we
the
should
broken
have just
glass,
killed him.
and immediately the
Then you
floor
had to
creaked
get all
under my
sentimental.
weight.
Oh, that stupid
These commercial
crap
buildings
about
weren't
old
built to
times.
last.
Dollar, I'm
Just
handling
basic
this.
construction.
Getting along the wall with that thing's under
11 weather without maintenance. I turned them into death traps. Every step I took, the floor bent and groaned. I could see down through gaps where the subfloor
He's
had
lighter or
rotted
heavier
away.
with all those
See the
holes
crawl
in it.
space underneath, filled with
Bullets
stagnant
probably had
water,
4 ounces.
and God
Good
knows
night,
what else.
Prince. Here's to all the old days.
The building
Awkward
made this sound
conversation
like it
with
was
Darla's
sighing,
parents
like
when
it
I
was
tell them
tired
their
of
daughter
holding itself
hit the
up.
big one.
I moved
Well,
slow,
at least
testing
the case
each
is
step
closed.
before putting my
Let's
full
get out of
weight
here.
down,
There's a service
heading
ladder
toward
that
the
should
back
take us
wall
right to the
where there
surface.
was a door that connected to the pharmacy. About halfway across the room, a section of ceiling above me started dropping dust and chunks of insulation. I looked up and saw the panels bowing, water-stained and swollen, and I knew if I stayed there another 10 seconds, I was going to have 50 pounds of wet ceiling material come down on my head. I moved faster, heard something crack behind me, didn't look back, made it to the door, and pushed through, just as a whole section collapsed where I'd been standing. The pharmacy was darker, only light coming through the front windows, which were mostly intact, but covered in grime. Someone had already been through here, that was obvious. The shelves were knocked over, medications scattered across the floor, everything that was useful or valuable long gone. I wasn't looking for prescription drugs, though. I was looking for food. People always forget that pharmacies sell other things. Protein bars, trail mix, those meal replacement drinks that taste like chalk but have enough calories to keep you moving. I found them in the back near where the refrigerator units used to be, behind a false panel that had been part of a display. Someone had stashed supplies here, probably early on when they still thought they'd come back for them later. 3 protein bars, peanut butter flavor, expired 6 months ago. 4 granola bars in smashed packaging. A bottle of multivitamins with maybe 20 pills left. And underneath all of that, wrapped in a plastic bag, a full bottle of antibiotics.
Nick,
Are you ready to talk?
Amoxicillin,
How'd you know to find me
500
down in that
milligrams,
old
30
vault?
capsules. I actually felt
your
my
secretary,
eyes watering
Ellie,
when I saw
she
them.
sent me.
She
Not
did.
from emotion
I should give
exactly,
her a
just from
raise.
relief so intense
Now, you
it
mentioned
felt
something
physical.
about tracking down a murderer, how he took your son. I
I
want
sat
you to
down
come
right
to my
there on the
office in
filthy
Diamond
floor
City.
and ate one of
Give
the
me all the
protein bars
details.
immediately.
Besides, I think you've earned
It was
a chance
stale,
to sit
and the
down and
chocolate
clear your
coating
head.
had that white film that happens when chocolate gets too old. But I didn't care.
Lead the way, Nick.
I ate
All
it
right,
in
let's
4
move
bites
fast.
and then opened
Follow
a
me.
granola bar and ate that too. My stomach cramped at first, rejecting food after running empty, but I kept it down. The antibiotics went into my pack along with everything else. I'd start taking them tonight, proper dosage, full course. The leg wound was already hot to the touch,
Traveling in the
inflammation
Commonwealth as
setting
long
in
as I
fast.
have, you learn a few things. These old buildings and alleyways give you a lot of opportunity.
That's when I
to
noticed
hide
my
if things
dosimeter
get
was
bad,
acting
so
strange.
That goes
The
both
reading
ways.
kept jumping between 2.1
Always keep your
and
eyes out.
4.7
Head on a
microsieverts per hour,
Things can go
flickering
from
back and
calm to
forth like it
deadly in
couldn't
a
decide what to do.
What's that?
I tapped it, shook it gently, and the display went completely blank for 30 seconds, coming back at 0.
Like the mayor's bragging, it really is
That
the
was
most
wrong.
secure settlement
I'd been in
around.
this building for 15 minutes,
Comes with a few.
and the radiation level doesn't change that fast unless you're moving between hot and cold zones. And I was standing still. The battery was dying. I pulled the back panel off and looked at the small rectangular cell inside, and even in the dim light I could see the corrosion on the contacts. These dosimeters are reliable if you maintain them, but I'd been running this one continuously for 11 months, and batteries don't last forever, especially not the specialty ones these devices use. I didn't have a spare. I'd been meaning to scavenge for replacements, but kept putting it off because the device was still working. And that's the kind of lazy thinking that gets you killed out here. Without a functioning dosimeter, I was navigating blind. Radiation is invisible, odorless, tasteless. You walk into a hot zone and you don't know it until hours later when you start feeling sick, and by then the damage is done. Your cells are already dying, your DNA already shredded, and there's nothing you can do except wait and see if you got a lethal dose, or just enough to shave a few years off your life. I thought about Thomas Reed, a guy I met back in month 3, who had military-grade radiation detection equipment, the kind that cost thousands before the war. He was so confident, always talking about safety margins and exposure limits, treating survival like an engineering problem he'd already solved. Found him dead in a shopping center parking lot about 2 weeks after we met. His equipment had failed, and he'd walked right into a hot spot without knowing it. Died alone, vomiting blood, his skin covered in burns that came from the inside out. I needed batteries, and I needed them before I made any more moves. But the immediate problem was hunger, and I still had food that needed cooking. The canned goods I'd been carrying in my pack for 3 days were all things that required heat. Beans, soup, stew. You can eat them cold, but it gives you cramps and worse. And when you're already dealing with radiation exposure and contaminated water, the last thing you need is digestive problems. Fire is
Everything
risk.
outside the wall ain't
Smoke
safe.
is visible for miles in
just
the
how it
clear
is.
air we have now, and visibility means anyone in the area knows where you are. In the early months, there were groups of people, some trying to help each other, some trying to take what others had. I'd avoided most human contact since then, not because I'm antisocial, but because every interaction is a gamble. Most people are desperate. Desperate people make bad decisions. But I needed to eat, needed real calories, and that meant fire. I found a spot in the pharmacy basement, down a concrete stairwell that led to a storage area. The walls were thick enough that they'd contain most of the smoke, and there was a small ventilation grate
So,
near
this
the
is the
ceiling
famous Diamond
that would
City.
let it dissipate slowly
Suppose I hope
instead
to
of
find more of a
billowing
gem
out
than
in
a
an
dusty
obvious
home
call.
base. Civilization.
I gathered
in the
some
rough,
cardboard
if you will.
boxes and wood scraps from broken pallets, built a small fire using a lighter I'd been carefully preserving. The
Hey, you in
flames
the paper,
caught
right?
quick, and I ran of
200 years
beams
old.
directly over them,
Pretty good for your age,
watching
huh?
the metal heat up and the contents start to bubble. The smell hit me hard. Real food smell, not just stale protein bars, but actual beans with sauce and seasoning. My mouth was watering and I had to force myself to wait until it was hot all the way through. I ate straight from the can, burning my tongue on the first bite, but not caring. Protein and carbohydrates and salt, exactly what my body was screaming for. I sat there in the basement with my small fire,
Ellie?
eating beans in the
Are you
darkness.
here?
And for maybe
Nick?
5 minutes, I wasn't thinking about radiation or wounds or failing
Oh,
equipment.
God. It's
Just
really
food.
you.
Well, it's hard to mistake this mug for anyone else.
When I finished, I put the
You keep
fire out
laughing at
carefully,
death.
scattered the
Someday
ashes,
Death's gonna
and
laugh
headed
back.
back up.
Not as long as I got
My
a
leg
few
was
friends
stiffening
to
up,
back me
the
up.
bandage
You say-
crusty with dried blood, and I knew I needed to get back to the fire station to properly clean and dress it with the antibiotics I'd found. But first, I needed those batteries. The pharmacy didn't have what I needed. These devices use a specific type that you don't find in TV remotes or flashlights. I'd have to trade for them. There's a woman I'd encountered twice before, Susan Mitchell, who operated out of a house about a mile west. She collected electronics, stripped them for parts, bartered components for food and supplies. I traded with her once, gave her a can
Oh,
opener for a
wow.
roll of duct
You're tall.
tape. Fair
Hi there.
exchange.
Do all you
If anyone
outsiders
had
wear such
dosimeter
funny
batteries,
clothes?
it would be her. The
Hey there,
problem was what
mister.
I had to trade.
Hey, pal.
Food was precious.
Hi.
Medicine was survival.
But Dad says
I had
not
the
to touch his
antibiotics,
genitals.
but I needed those for my leg. What I could spare was half the bottle, 15 pills. Enough for her if she needed them. Enough for me to complete a course if I rationed carefully. I made it to her place just after noon, and she was outside, working on something that looked like a car battery. She saw me coming and didn't reach for a weapon, which was as good as a friendly greeting out here. I held up my hands to show I wasn't a threat and walked closer. She looked at my leg, the blood-stained bandage visible through my torn pants, and she looked at my face. I must have looked rough because her expression shifted from neutral to concerned. I explained what I needed, showed her the dosimeter with its failing battery. She nodded, disappeared into her house, came back with 2 batteries in sealed packaging. Actual new ones, probably from a medical supply cache. I showed her the
Yes?
antibiotics, and her eyes went wide. She needed them.
Hey.
I could
Mr.
tell by
Neville?
the way she looked at the bottle, the way her hand went unconsciously to her arm where I could see a bandage
Hoarding
under
now?
her sleeve. We didn't discuss it. I gave her 15 pills.
Heads up.
She gave me the batteries.
There we
We both
are.
nodded, and I left.
It's time for us to part ways.
Right then, sir.
Walking back
You
to
know
the
where
fire
I'll be should
station,
you require
I installed the new batteries in the dosimeter and watched it come to life, displaying a steady 1.8 microsieverts per hour. Real data again.
I want to
Real
trade a few
navigation.
things.
Of course.
The relief was intense enough that I had to stop walking for a minute and just breathe. It was almost 1 in the afternoon and I'd secured water, food, medicine, and working equipment. A successful morning by post-apocalypse standards. My leg was infected, my radiation exposure was climbing, and I was exhausted, but I was still alive and still moving forward. That's what Tuesday means now. I was maybe 200 meters from the pharmacy, cutting through what used to be a residential street, when I heard footsteps behind me. Not running, not trying to sneak, just walking, steady and deliberate. I stopped and turned around slowly, keeping my hands visible, and there was a man standing about 15 feet back. Mid-30s maybe, hard to tell because everyone looks older now. He was thin in a way that went past skinny into something worse, his clothes hanging face that hadn't healed right. Radiation sickness. Advanced stage. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. We just looked at each other for maybe 10 seconds, and in that time I was doing calculations. He wasn't armed that I could see. He was weak, probably couldn't fight even if he wanted to. But desperation makes people unpredictable, and he looked desperate in a way that went deeper than hunger. He raised one hand slowly and pointed at my backpack, then pointed at his mouth. The meaning was clear enough. I had food in that pack. 3 protein bars, 2 granola bars, a can of soup. Enough to keep me going for another 2 days if I rationed properly. I also had a man in front of me who was dying whether I helped him or not. The radiation had already done its work, already destroyed enough of his cells that his body was failing piece by piece. Hair loss, skin lesions, the way he moved like every step hurt. These were signs that he had weeks at most. Giving him food wouldn't save him. It would just make his last days slightly less miserable. I thought about that for longer than I'm proud of. Stood there doing the math like it was a problem with a correct answer. If I gave him food, I had less. If I had less, my margin for error got smaller. What if I couldn't find more supplies tomorrow? What if I got injured again and couldn't scavenge for a week? Every calorie I gave away was a calorie I might need later. But I also kept thinking about how he was already dead, how nothing I did mattered for him in any meaningful way, and how that made it easier to justify keeping everything for myself. I reached into my pack and pulled out 1 can of soup, vegetable beef, dented but sealed. I rolled it across the cracked pavement toward him, and he bent down to pick it up, moving slow like his joints didn't work right anymore. He looked at the can, then looked at me, and nodded once. Then he turned and walked away, heading toward a collapsed house across the street. I watched him go, and I felt something that was equal parts relief and guilt, and I hated that I felt either one because both emotions were useless out here. The truth is, I don't know what the right choice was. Before the war, I would have given him everything, would have tried to help, would have felt good about being a decent person. Now I give him 1 can and feel guilty it wasn't more, while simultaneously wondering if I should have given him anything at all. That's what this world does. It turns basic human kindness into a tactical decision and makes you question whether compassion is just another luxury you can't afford. I kept walking, and about 10 minutes later, I noticed I was being followed again. Not a person this time. A dog. Medium-sized, maybe some kind of shepherd mix, fur matted and dirty. You could see its ribs clearly through the skin, and its eyes had that sharp, alert look that meant it was surviving somehow, finding food where there wasn't any, which made it smarter than most of the people who died in the first months. It kept about 20 feet back, watching me, but not approaching. Dogs didn't make it in large numbers. The ones that survived their owners either died quickly from starvation or got smart fast. This one had clearly gotten smart. It was tracking me because it had smelled the food, probably watched me eat the beans in the pharmacy basement, and followed my scent trail. I stopped walking and it stopped too. I pulled out a piece of protein bar, just a chunk about the size of my thumb, and tossed it toward the dog. It moved forward cautiously, sniffed the food, then ate it in 1 quick bite. Then it sat down and looked at me like it was waiting for instructions. I didn't want a dog. Dogs need food and water same as people, and I was barely keeping myself alive. But I also recognized that this animal had survived 11 months of nuclear fallout, radiation exposure, complete ecosystem collapse, something. It meant adaptation. I started walking again and the dog followed, maintaining that same 20-foot distance. Fine, it could follow. I wasn't gonna feed it regularly, and I wasn't gonna name it, and I definitely wasn't gonna get attached to it. But if it wanted to trail behind me, that was its choice. About half a mile from the fire station, I saw something that made me stop. There was a body in the street, fresh, maybe a day old at most. Woman in her 40s, wearing clothes that were cleaner than most, lying on her back with her arms at her sides like she'd laid down to rest and never got up. No visible injuries, no blood, no signs of violence. Just dead. I checked around carefully before approaching, making sure I wasn't walking into some kind of trap or ambush, then moved closer. She died from radiation sickness. I could tell by looking at her. The skin discoloration, the way her lips were cracked and bleeding, the vomit stains on her shirt. It was the same progression I'd seen dozens of times. Your body breaks down from the inside, your immune system fails, your organs shut down one by one, and eventually you just stop. It's not fast and it's not peaceful, but it's thorough. She probably knew she was dying, probably felt it happening for weeks, and at some point she decided to lie down in the street because it didn't matter where anymore. I should have kept walking. There was nothing I could do for her, and standing in the open
Don't
like
think I
this
can
was
pick this.
asking for trouble. But I noticed something clutched in her hand. A photograph, the old-fashioned kind printed on paper. I pulled it free carefully and looked at it. Family picture. The dead woman, a man who might have been her husband, 2 kids. Boy and girl, maybe 8 and 10 years old. Everyone's smiling like they were at a theme park or a birthday party. Normal life frozen in chemical emulsion. I looked at that photo for a long time and tried to figure out what I was supposed to feel. These people were probably dead. The kids, the husband, all of them gone in the first weeks or months. This woman had carried their picture with her all the way to the end, and now she was lying in a street. And I was standing over her like some kind of scavenger. I checked her pockets out of habit, found nothing useful except a lighter that still worked, and I took it because I needed it. Then I put the photograph back in her hand and folded her fingers over it. The dog was watching me from a distance,
That's it.
head tilted, like it was trying to understand what I was doing. I wanted to bury her. That was the thought that kept pushing into my head. She deserved better than lying in the street until she decomposed or animals got to her. But I didn't have time, and I didn't have energy, and most importantly, I didn't have the luxury of pretending that dignity mattered anymore. The dead don't care what happens to their bodies. Only the living care about that, and usually only when the bodies belong to people they loved. I kept walking, and the dog kept following. When I got back to the fire station, it was almost 3 in the afternoon, and my leg was throbbing so bad I could feel my pulse in the wound. I sat down on the concrete floor and unwrapped the bandage, and what I saw wasn't good. The cut was inflamed, hot to the touch, with red streaks starting to spread up toward my knee. Classic infection signs. I cleaned it as best I could with my remaining clean water, applied more antiseptic cream that probably wasn't doing anything, and then took 3 of the antibiotic pills from the bottle I'd found. Loading dose, trying to get ahead of the infection before it got ahead of me. The dog sat outside the station about the man with radiation sickness, the one I'd given the soup to. By now, he was probably in that collapsed house, eating slowly, making it last. Maybe it would make him feel better for an hour or two. Maybe he'd remember what it felt like to not be hungry, even if he couldn't remember what it felt like to not be dying. I thought about the woman in the street with the photograph, and how she'd held on to that picture of her family like it was an anchor to a world that didn't exist anymore. And I thought about myself, sitting in an abandoned fire station with an infected leg and a stray dog, broadcasting into the void every week because I couldn't stand the idea of all of this happening without someone writing it down. None of it made sense. The choices I was making, the reasons I was still trying, the calculations I was doing every single moment about who deserved help and who deserved food and whether any of it mattered. But here's what I figured out sitting there in the afternoon light watching that dog watch me. It doesn't have to make sense. It just has to keep you alive until tomorrow. And if tomorrow comes, you do it all over again. That's Tuesday. That's every day now. You make the choices that let you see Wednesday. And you don't think too hard about whether those choices make you a good person or a bad person, because those categories don't mean what they used to mean. Around 4 in the afternoon, the sky started changing. I was sitting in the fire station treating my leg wound for the second time when I noticed the light coming through the windows had gone flat and gray. When I looked outside, clouds were building up fast from the west. Rain was coming, and rain out here is never just rain. It's a delivery system for whatever radiation is still floating around in the atmosphere. Particles that got kicked up into the air months ago and are still coming down whenever weather patterns shift. The clouds were moving faster than normal weather, pushed by winds I couldn't feel yet at ground level, but that were clearly strong up high. I checked my dosimeter, and it was reading 1.1 microsieverts per hour, normal for my location. But that number meant nothing once rain started falling. Water concentrates radiation. It pulls particles out of the air, washes them off surfaces, funnels them into low areas and drainage systems. A light drizzle can turn a safe zone into a hot spot in 30 minutes. I had maybe an hour before the storm hit, and I needed shelter that would keep me dry and protected.
Hey,
The fire
Codsworth.
station had a
Shall
roof,
I
but
accompany
it
you,
was
sir?
compromised.
Yes,
Holes
of
in
course.
places
Right
where
behind you,
debris had
sir.
punched through, and I knew from previous rains that water came in along the back wall. I needed something better. I started mentally cataloging options. There was a basement shelter I'd scouted about half a mile east, underneath what used to be an office building. Solid concrete, good drainage, no obvious leaks. That had been my backup plan for weeks. I packed my essential gear, the radio equipment, water, food, medical supplies, and headed out. The dog fell into step behind me without any prompting, and I didn't tell it to stay because having something alive nearby felt better than being completely alone with a radioactive storm coming. The wind was picking up now, pushing trash and dried leaves down the empty streets, and the temperature was dropping fast. February rain in California used to mean cold but manageable. Now it meant potential contamination and hours stuck inside, breathing stale air while you waited for the all clear. I made it to the office building in 20 minutes and immediately saw the problem. The basement entrance was flooded. Not just wet, actually flooded with standing water that reflected the gray sky like a mirror. My dosimeter jumped to 6.3 microsieverts per hour near the water's edge. The drainage system had backed up or broken, and now the basement was a radiation reservoir. Everything that had washed off the building and the surrounding area for the past 11 months was concentrated in that water. I couldn't go in there without walking through it. And walking through it meant soaking my boots and pants in contaminated water that I'd then be stuck with for hours. The first raindrops hit while I was standing there trying to figure out my next move. Big, heavy drops that smacked against the pavement and left dark circles. I needed shelter immediately. I looked around and spotted a convenience store across the street, windows mostly intact, door hanging open. Not ideal, but better than nothing. I ran for it and the dog ran with me, both of us getting inside just as the rain started coming down hard. The store was a wreck inside, shelves knocked over, merchandise scattered and rotted, the smell of mold and decay thick enough to taste. But it was dry, or at least the area near the back wall was dry. I moved there quickly, checking the ceiling for leaks, and found a spot that seemed solid. The dog shook itself off and settled into a corner, watching me with those alert eyes.
Where you found this.
I pulled out my dosimeter and checked the reading. 2.7 microsieverts per hour, higher than I wanted, but not immediately dangerous. Then I heard it. Water running. Not the rain on the roof, but water flowing somewhere inside the building. I followed the sound to the back area near where the restrooms would have been, and I saw water seeping under the exterior wall, a steady trickle that was pooling on the floor and spreading slowly toward where I'd set up. The building wasn't sealed. Rain was getting in through cracks and gaps, and that water was coming from outside, where it had washed across contaminated surfaces. I tested the water with my dosimeter and watched the numbers climb. 8.4 microsieverts per hour. The water was hot, and it was spreading. I had maybe 10 minutes before it reached my dry spot, and once it did, I'd be sitting in contamination with no way to avoid it. I looked at the dog, and it looked back at me, and I made a decision. I started grabbing anything I could find to block the water. Old magazines, cardboard boxes, plastic bags, pieces of broken shelving. I built a makeshift dam between me and the incoming water, piling materials and weighing them down with debris. It held for about 5 minutes. Then the water found a gap and started seeping through. I plugged the gap with my jacket, then with a piece of rubber floor mat, but the water kept finding new routes. It was like trying to stop a leak in a boat with your hands. The rain outside was getting heavier, drumming on the roof so hard it sounded like static, and I knew this wasn't going to work. I was going to end up sitting in radioactive runoff whether I wanted to or not. I moved everything I could to higher ground, climbed up on top of a shelving unit that was still anchored to the wall, pulled my gear up with me, helped the dog scramble up by lifting it under its front legs. We sat there about 4 feet off the ground while the water spread across the floor below us, dark and oily looking in the dim light. My dosimeter was reading 3.8 microsieverts per hour now, elevated from the moisture in the air and the contaminated water vapors rising up from below. The rain lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of sitting on a metal shelf in a dark store, watching radioactive water pool beneath me, trying not to think about how much exposure I was accumulating just from breathing the air. The dog pressed against my side, and I let it, both of us sharing body heat as the temperature dropped. I thought about Emily Parker during that wait. She was a school teacher I'd met in the 4th month. Smart woman, careful about everything. She'd survived the initial chaos, avoided collected rainwater without testing it first. Just filled up containers and drank it because she was so thirsty, and it looked clean. I found her 2 weeks later in a house 3 blocks from where she'd been staying. She was already dead by then, lying in a bed with towels around her because of the bleeding. Radiation poisoning from that water had destroyed her bone marrow, her digestive system, everything. She died alone and in pain, and all because she'd made one mistake about water that looked perfectly clear and clean. Sitting on that shelf, breathing air that tasted like metal and chemicals, I wondered if I was making the same kind of mistake. The dosimeter said the exposure was manageable, but dosimeters only measure certain types of radiation. They don't tell you about particulates you're breathing, about contamination that's getting on your skin, about the long-term accumulation that happens when you make 1,000 small compromises over 11 months. Every choice out here is a gamble, and you don't know if you lost until weeks or months later when your
Guys.
body starts failing. The rain finally stopped around 7 in the evening. The water on the floor had risen to maybe 3 inches deep before it stabilized, and now it was slowly draining away through cracks and gaps in the foundation. I waited another 30 minutes to make sure the rain was actually done.
Nice.
Then climbed down carefully, avoiding the water as much as possible. My boots still got wet. There was no way to avoid it completely. I checked the dosimeter and it showed 5.1 microsieverts per hour near the puddles, lower now that the rain had stopped, but still elevated. I needed to get back to the fire station, clean myself and my gear, take more antibiotics because I could feel the infection in my leg getting worse despite the medication. My whole calf was swollen now and hot to the touch, and I was pretty sure I was running a low-grade fever. The dog followed me out of the store, and we started walking back through streets that were slick with rainwater, everything reflecting the late afternoon light in ways that made it hard to see where the contaminated puddles were versus regular
Mr.
water.
Valentine seems to be quite the detective.
My dosimeter was reading between 3 and 7 microsieverts per hour, depending on where I walked, and I tried to stick to higher ground, avoiding the drainage areas where I knew the radiation would be concentrated. The walk took twice as long as it should have because I had to keep circling around hot spots and flooded sections. By the time I got back to the fire station, it was almost dark, and I was exhausted in a
Heads
way
up.
that went past physical tiredness into something deeper. I stripped off my wet clothes outside, tested them with the dosimeter, and got readings high enough that I knew I couldn't wear them again without washing. But washing meant using water I needed for drinking, and I'd already burned through most of my clean supply treating my leg wound. I made the decision to seal the contaminated clothes in a plastic bag and deal with them later, maybe never.
Yes, sir.
Wore my backup clothes, the last clean set I had, and knew that tomorrow I'd have to figure out laundry somehow. The dog was contaminated too, its fur wet and probably carrying radiation, but there wasn't much I could do about that. I wiped it down with an old towel, threw the towel away, and told myself it was fine, even though I had no idea if it was fine. The animal settled near the door, watching the darkness outside, and I sat down against the wall to catch my breath. I checked my total exposure for the day. Between the creek incident this morning, the time in the hot zones, and 3 hours in that store breathing contaminated air, I'd accumulated roughly 8.2 millisieverts. That's about 3 months worth of normal background radiation condensed into one Tuesday. My running total since the war started was now somewhere around 55 millisieverts. The danger threshold closer to that line than I wanted to be. The storm hadn't killed me, but it had cost me. Wet clothes, elevated exposure, wasted time, and stress that my body didn't need while fighting an infection. And for what? I'd survived another few hours, made it through another weather event. The same thing I'd been doing for 11 months, just with different variables. Rain instead of heat, flooding instead of drought. Same basic equation of trying to avoid enough radiation to stay functional,
Yes.
while accepting that I was
They're
dying
used to
slowly,
that.
whether I liked it or
My
not.
hat.
That's what the storm taught me. Sitting there in the dark with a contaminated dog and an infected leg. You can do everything right and still lose. You can make good decisions and still get hurt. The world doesn't care about your planning or your caution. It just keeps throwing problems at you until eventually one of them sticks and you don't get back up. All you can do is try to make that day not be today. Try to push it off until tomorrow, until next week, until next month. That's the game. That's the only game left. The route back to the fire station should have been simple. I'd walked it dozens of times, knew every street and shortcut, could navigate it half asleep. But when I got to the intersection where I normally turned east, there was water everywhere. The storm had overwhelmed the drainage system, and now the whole street was flooded, water pooling maybe a foot deep and spreading into yards and driveways. My dosimeter started climbing the moment I got close. 4.6 microsieverts per hour at the edge, and I knew it would be worse in the middle where the water was deepest. I couldn't cross that, not after already soaking my boots in the convenience store, not with my cumulative exposure already past 50 millisieverts for the year. I had to find another way, which meant going through residential areas I hadn't scouted, streets I didn't know the radiation patterns for. The sun was setting and I was losing light fast, and navigating unknown territory in the dark with a failing fever and an infected leg was exactly the kind of mistake that gets you killed. I headed north, trying to loop around the flooded zone, and the dog stayed with me like it understood we were in this together now. The houses in this area were in bad shape, roofs collapsed, walls caved in, front yards overgrown with dead vegetation that had turned brown and brittle.
Look
Some
alive.
houses still had cars in the driveways, windows broken out, rust eating through the metal.
Well, if anyone.
I checked my
could figure
dosimeter
out-
every 30 seconds, watching for spikes, and the reading stayed between 2 and 3 microsieverts. Manageable, but not comfortable. That's when I saw the house with the door open, like someone had walked out and forgotten to close it behind them. Something about that bothered me, the casualness of it, and I should have kept walking, but I didn't. I moved closer, checked the dosimeter, 1.8 microsieverts, and looked inside. The interior was dark, but I could see shapes, furniture still in place, pictures on the walls. Someone had lived here, and recently enough that the place hadn't been completely stripped by scavengers. I went in because I needed supplies, and because empty houses sometimes have useful things, and because I was tired enough that caution was starting to feel optional. The front room had a couch with cushions still on it, a coffee table with magazines scattered across the surface, all of them dated from before the war. There was a smell in the air, faint but distinct, and it took me a second to place it. Decay. Old death. Something had died in this house, and the smell had mostly faded but not completely. I found them in the bedroom. 3 bodies. A man, a woman, and between them a small shape that I didn't look at too closely because I didn't need that image in my head. They were lying in bed like they'd gone to sleep together, covers pulled up, and they'd been dead for months. The bodies were mostly decomposed, just bones and dried tissue and stained fabric. No signs of violence, no trauma I could see. They just died, probably from radiation sickness, probably slow and painful. And at some point they'd made the decision to lie down together and not get back up. I should have left immediately, but I saw something on the nightstand that made me pause. Medications. Bottles of pills lined up neatly, some empty, some still full. I moved closer, trying not to breathe too deeply because of the smell, and checked the labels. Pain medication, anti-nausea pills, sleeping tablets. Nothing that would help my infection, nothing I could use, but there was also a first aid kit on the floor beside the bed. I picked it up and opened it. Bandages, antiseptic wipes, medical tape, and at the bottom a small bottle of iodine solution. Iodine can disinfect wounds. It's harsh and it burns like fire, but it kills bacteria that antibiotics sometimes miss. I took the bandages and tape, and I took a blanket from a closet because mine was contaminated from the storm and I needed something clean. Then I left quickly, stepping back into the fading daylight and breathing fresh air that didn't smell like death. The dog was waiting outside, sitting on the front lawn like it was standing guard. I gave it another piece of protein bar, the last piece I had, and we kept moving. My leg was getting worse. I could feel it with every step, a deep ache that was spreading up into my hip. The fever was making everything feel distant and unreal, like I was watching myself from outside my body. I knew these were bad signs, knew that infection plus radiation exposure plus exhaustion was a dangerous combination, but knowing didn't change anything. I still had to get back to the fire station.
Look
I
alive.
finally made it around the flooded area
all in?
by cutting through a park that was now just dead
What
grass
is it, sir?
and broken playground equipment.
You can go now.
The swings
Right then,
hung
sir.
motionless
You
on
know where I'll
rusted
be should
chains,
you require anything.
and there were still backpacks scattered around from kids who dropped them 11 months ago when their parents came to pick them up in a panic. I didn't stop to look closely. The park gave me a clear line back to my area, and I took it, moving as fast as my leg would allow. By the time I reached the fire station, it was almost dark, and I was shaking from fever and exertion. I stumbled inside, dropped my pack, and sat down hard on the floor. The dog came in behind me and settled near the door, watching me with those alert eyes. I knew I needed to treat the leg wound immediately, knew I couldn't wait any longer, so I pulled out the iodine I'd taken from the house and unwrapped the bandage. The wound looked worse than this morning. The edges were swollen and angry red. The red streaks had spread further, dark lines running up my thigh like veins filled with ink. I opened the iodine bottle and poured it directly into the cut without thinking about it too much, and the pain was so intense I actually yelled. The dog's ears went back, but it didn't move. I gritted my teeth and kept pouring until the whole wound was covered in brown antiseptic. Then I sat there gasping while the burning slowly faded to a tolerable throb. I used the clean bandages from the first aid kit and wrapped the leg properly, tight enough to keep pressure not so tight it cut off circulation. I checked the time on my watch, one of the few pieces of technology still working. 8:40 in the evening. I'd been awake for almost 15 hours, and every single one of them had been spent fighting to stay alive. Water crisis, injury, scavenging, trading, storm, navigation, now infection treatment. Just another Tuesday in the fallout. Just the normal impossible grind of trying to survive